You think you can walk into my courtroom and demand justice? You're nothing but a statistic, Mr. Hayes. Another thug off my streets, the judge sneered, his lip curling in undisguised contempt as he slammed his heavy wooden gavel down with a deafening crack. He thought he was entirely untouchable, a god in a black robe. He thought he had just effortlessly framed an ordinary, defenseless black man to cover up his own multi-million-dollar criminal syndicate. But Judge Victor Langford made one fatal, irreversible mistake. The man standing quietly before him in heavy steel shackles wasn't a nobody to be swept under the rug. He was Leonard Hayes, the deeply undercover chief of the FBI's Public Corruption Task Force, and he had the corrupt judge exactly where he wanted him. High above the bustling windswept streets of Chicago, inside the imposing glass and steel structure of the Dirksen U.S. Courthouse, Judge Victor Langford sat in his expansive mahogany-paneled chambers. The room smelled of expensive leather, aged scotch, and absolute power. To the outside world, Langford was a pillar of the legal community, a tough-on-crime jurist who quoted the Constitution with a booming theatrical baritone that captivated juries, charmed the local press, and terrified defense attorneys. He was the city's golden boy of jurisprudence. But behind the heavy oak doors of his private office, insulated by soundproof walls and loyal clerks, Langford was the architect of one of the most lucrative and insidious corruption rings in the Midwest. He was a man who sold blind justice to the highest bidder, laundering tens of millions in cartel bribes and corporate embezzlement kickbacks through a complex web of shell companies nested safely in the Cayman Islands. For nearly a decade, Langford had operated with absolute terrifying impunity. He was a master of the system's blind spots. He manipulated dockets with a subtle nod to a corrupted clerk, suppressed vital evidence on razor-thin legal technicalities, and orchestrated mistrials with a quiet whisper in his chambers. But recently, a sprawling federal sting operation had come dangerously close to exposing his primary bagman, a slick thousand-an-hour local defense attorney named Marcus Thorne. The FBI had raided Thorne's downtown office, seizing hard drives and unredacted ledgers. Langford's pulse had been running hot for weeks. He desperately needed a distraction. He needed a high-profile scapegoat to throw the hungry local media and the encroaching federal investigators off his scent. He needed a narrative that fit the city's deeply ingrained prejudices perfectly. A neat, easily digestible story of a low-level, opportunistic criminal caught red-handed with stolen federal funds. Enter Leonard Hayes. To Langford, Leonard was just a name printed on a meticulously forged police incident report. The narrative Langford and his highly compensated police contacts had spun was brilliantly simple. Leonard Hayes, a seemingly ordinary mid-level construction contractor working on a lucrative city municipal building project, had supposedly been caught facilitating a massive kickback scheme. According to the fabricated file, Hayes had been pulled over and caught with $300,000 of sequentially marked bills stuffed into a duffel bag in the trunk of his battered sedan. Langford had reviewed the fabricated file late one evening, a cold, predatory smile spreading across his face. Hayes was an out-of-towner, a black man with no immediate family in Chicago, living in a modest month-to-month rental in the South Loop. Statistically, he was the perfect invisible target. No high-priced corporate lawyers would come running to his defense. No powerful politicians would ask uncomfortable questions on his behalf. He would simply be swallowed whole by the massive unforgiving machine of the criminal justice system. A system Langford controlled like a grand puppeteer. What Langford didn't know, what absolutely no one outside of a highly classified windowless SCIF at the FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C. knew, was that Leonard Hayes, the contractor, was a carefully constructed phantom. His real identity was Special Agent in Charge Leonard Hayes, the newly appointed chief of the FBI's elite public corruption unit. Hayes had spent the last 2 grueling years dismantling systemic corruption from the inside out, operating deep undercover at immense personal cost. Recognizing the pattern of Langford's syndicate, Hayes had purposely placed himself directly in the crosshairs, dangling himself as irresistible bait in a trap that the arrogant, desperate judge was eagerly walking right into. As Langford sipped his $200 single malt scotch, admiring the sprawling, glittering view of Lake Michigan, he finalized the arrest warrant. He signed his name with a dramatic flourish, the sharp scratch of his expensive Mont Blanc fountain pen echoing loudly in the quiet room. Too easy, Langford muttered to himself, admiring the authority of his own signature. He truly believed he was the grandmaster of the board, maneuvering disposable pawns to protect his king. He had absolutely no idea that he wasn't the player in this game. He was the prey, and the trap had just snapped shut. The subterranean cavern of Lower Wacker Drive was a claustrophobic nightmare of concrete pillars and yellow sodium lights. It was 11:45 p.m. on a freezing Tuesday. The freezing rain slicking the asphalt. The flashing red and blue lights of 3 Chicago police cruisers reflected sharply off the puddles, illuminating the concrete walls with a chaotic strobe effect. Leonard Hayes kept his hands highly visible, gripping the steering wheel of his intentionally unassuming 2012 Ford Taurus at 10 and 2. He watched in the rearview mirror as 3 officers approached, their silhouettes imposing, hands resting menacingly on their holstered service weapons. This was it, the point of no return. "Step out of the vehicle. Keep your hands where I can see them right now," barked the lead officer, a man Leonard immediately recognized from months of wiretap surveillance as Officer Miller, one of Langford's most reliable, heavily compensated attack dogs. Leonard complied slowly, letting his shoulders slump inward, perfectly adopting the nervous, frantic body language of a terrified, confused civilian who had never been in trouble with the law. "Is there a problem, officer? I was just heading home from the job site." "I haven't been drinking," Leonard said, his voice laced with the exact right amount of tremor and panic. "Shut up. Face the car." "Hands on the roof," Miller growled, kicking Leonard's legs apart roughly, his heavy boots connecting with Leonard's ankles. As Miller conducted an overly aggressive, bruising pat-down, another officer immediately bypassed the cabin and popped the trunk. "Bingo," the second officer called out over the sound of the idling engines. "We got the bag, heavy as hell." Leonard turned his head slightly, his eyes widening in feigned absolute shock as the officer pulled a heavy black canvas duffel bag from the trunk. A bag Leonard knew for a fact had not been there when he left the site 10 minutes ago. It was unzipped to reveal thick stacks of $100 bills perfectly arranged to look like a massive illicit payoff, destined for a cartel drop. "What is that?" "That's not mine. I swear to God, you have to believe me." "I've never seen that bag before," Leonard protested loudly, his voice cracking, playing his part flawlessly. Miller violently yanked Leonard's arms behind his back. The steel cuffs bit tightly and painfully into his wrists. The cold metal a stark physical reminder of the brutal reality of the system he was investigating. "Save your breath for the judge, buddy. You're going away for a long, long time," Miller sneered, shoving Leonard roughly into the hard plastic back seat of the cruiser. 48 hours later, exhausted and sleep-deprived, Leonard found himself standing in a bright, intimidating courtroom inside the Dirksen building, wearing an oversized, scratchy orange Cook County Jail jumpsuit. The heavy wooden doors swung open, and the bailiff bellowed, "All rise." The Honorable Judge Victor Langford presiding. Langford swept into the room with calculated majesty, his black robes billowing behind him, radiating an aura of absolute unquestionable authority. He took his seat at the elevated bench, looking down at Leonard from his high perch, with a gaze that was equal parts manufactured contempt and hidden triumphant satisfaction. "Mr. Hayes," Langford began, his voice echoing off the rich marble walls, dripping with theatrical sorrow for the city's decay. "The charges against you are exceptionally severe. Grand larceny, conspiracy to commit fraud, and possession of hundreds of thousands in stolen federal municipal funds. The evidence presented by the arresting officers in their preliminary report is frankly overwhelming." Leonard's court-appointed public defender, actually a brilliant, sharply trained undercover federal prosecutor named David Ross, dressed in a cheap, ill-fitting suit, spoke up with manufactured weakness. "Your Honor, my client has absolutely no prior criminal record. He's a hard-working man. We respectfully request bail be set at a reasonable amount. He has surrendered his passport and is clearly not a flight risk." Langford's eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. He leaned forward over the heavy oak bench, staring directly at Leonard to deliver his fatal blow. "No prior record doesn't mean innocent, Counselor. It just means he hasn't been caught until now. Given the staggering, audacious sum of money found in this man's possession, and the extreme flight risk he poses to the community, bail is unequivocally denied. The defendant will be remanded to the maximum security wing of Cook County pending trial." Langford slammed his gavel with a thunderous crack that made the gallery jump. He looked down at Leonard, fully expecting to see a broken, weeping, terrified man begging for mercy. Instead, for a fraction of a second, Leonard raised his chin and met the judge's gaze. There was no fear in Leonard's eyes, only a cold, analytical, piercing stillness. Langford felt a brief, inexplicable shiver run down his spine, a primal warning deep in his gut that he quickly brushed away as paranoia. He had won. The scapegoat was safely caged. The money trail was covered. The air in the maximum security wing of the Cook County Jail was thick with the suffocating smell of industrial bleach, stale sweat, and crushing despair. Leonard sat on the edge of a thin, rigid cot in an isolated 6x8 cell. The constant rattling clanging of heavy metal doors, the distant echoing shouts of angry inmates, and the relentless buzzing of the fluorescent lights formed a relentless psychological soundtrack of misery. To anyone else, this environment would be a soul-crushing nightmare. To Leonard Hayes, it was merely his temporary command center. He had spent the last 5 agonizing days enduring the intense psychological and physical toll of incarceration. Maintaining his civilian cover perfectly, he forced down the terrible, unidentifiable food, kept his head down and his eyes averted during his 1 hour in the concrete yard, and expertly projected the slumped, hollow image of a defeated, hopeless man. But beneath the surface, his mind was operating at 100 miles an hour, analyzing every variable of his intricate operation. On the 6th day, a guard's heavy keys rattled in the lock. The steel door slid open. "Hayes, you got a visitor." "Legal counsel." "Move it." Leonard was escorted down a long, bleak corridor to a small soundproof visitation room divided by a thick pane of heavily scratched bulletproof plexiglass. Sitting on the other side, wearing a sharp-tailored gray suit and looking intensely professional, was Special Agent Sarah Jenkins, Leonard's second-in-command at the FBI. She slid a thick unmarked manila folder through the narrow brushed steel slot at the bottom of the glass. To the board guards monitoring the overhead cameras, it looked exactly like a standard depressing legal document review. "How are the accommodations, Chief?" Jenkins asked softly, her eyes betraying a genuine hint of concern beneath her steely professional exterior. She could see the fatigue etched into his face. "I've slept on worse," Leonard replied, his voice a low, raspy murmur. "What's the status of the wiretaps? Did you take the bait after the arraignment?" Jenkins smiled thinly, a predator finding the scent. She opened the folder, revealing heavily redacted Title III wiretap transcripts rather than legal briefs. He swallowed it hook, line, and sinker. "Langford got sloppy just like you predicted. 2 nights ago, after he denied your bail, he had a private celebratory dinner with Marcus Thorne at a high-end steakhouse in River North. We had a directional mic pointed right at their table from a parked van across the street. Read page 4. Leonard scanned the transcript, his eyes darting across the text. "Langford, the contractor is locked up tight, denied his bail myself. The idiot didn't even put up a fight. Looked like a deer in headlights. It's a perfect wrap-up. The feds will spend the next 2 years chasing the money trail we planted in his trunk, and we proceed with the Cayman transfers on Friday. He's taking the fall for the whole operation." Leonard felt a surge of cold, vindicating satisfaction wash over him. The chill of the jail cell seemed to vanish. There it is. He admitted to the framing, the offshore accounts, and the specific intent to divert a federal investigation. We have the motive, the mechanism, and the confession. It's a lock. We also pulled the dash cam and body cam footage from your arrest, Chief, Jenkins continued, leaning closer to the glass. The digital timestamps don't match the dispatch logs by a margin of 12 minutes. We can definitively prove Officer Miller planted the bag of cash while the cameras were supposedly malfunctioning. Miller is already sweating. He knows the timeline is busted. We squeeze him right now and he flips on the judge today. "No," Leonard said firmly, his eyes flashing with a dangerous, calculating intelligence. "Do not touch Miller. Not yet. If we grab the pawns off the board, the king will realize his flank is compromised, and he'll initiate his burn protocols to destroy the offshore ledgers. We wait. Langford is deeply arrogant. His ego is his fatal flaw. He wants a massive public spectacle to show the city and the press that he's tough on corruption. He's going to fast-track my trial to parade his victory." "You actually want to go to trial?" Jenkins asked, her professional calm cracking with surprise. "Chief, that's incredibly risky. If anything goes wrong in that courtroom, if a sympathetic jury buys his rhetoric before we drop the net." "Nothing will go wrong," Leonard interrupted smoothly, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Let him build his grand theatrical stage. Let him bring in the news cameras, the reporters, and his cronies. The bigger the audience he gathers to watch my execution, the harder and more permanent his own fall will be. Have the hostage rescue team and the tactical unit stand by. When I give the signal in that courtroom, you bring the hammer down on the entire courthouse. Jenkins nodded slowly, gathering the sensitive files and sliding them back into her briefcase. Understood, Director. We'll be ready for the breach. As Leonard walked back to his cell, the heavy metal door slamming shut behind him with finality, he didn't feel trapped in a cage. He felt like a trapdoor spider sitting patiently in the dark at the center of a very large, very complex web. Judge Langford was about to learn a brutal lesson about the justice system. It wasn't blind. It was just waiting in the shadows for the perfect moment to strike. 3 agonizingly slow weeks later, Courtroom 204 in the Dirksen building was packed to absolute maximum capacity. The air was stifling, buzzing with anticipation. Judge Langford had pulled every corrupt string he had, cashing in favors to ensure the Hayes corruption case was fast-tracked past the usual bureaucratic backlog and heavily publicized. The wooden pews were crammed with local reporters, rapid-fire sketch artists, and curious, judgmental onlookers, eager to see the men who had supposedly stolen hundreds of thousands in taxpayer dollars. Langford sat high upon his elevated judicial bench, looking down at his domain like a medieval king holding court over his peasants. He wore his black robes with theatrical, almost religious flair, projecting an image of absolute unquestionable integrity. To his right, the prosecution table was manned by an ambitious, aggressive assistant district attorney who had been handpicked by Langford, a sharp-suited lawyer, completely unaware he was aggressively prosecuting a federal ghost. To the left, Leonard Hayes sat slouched in a cheap, ill-fitting gray suit provided by the county lockup. He looked appropriately exhausted, his posture slightly stooped, his hands folded quietly in his lap, as if resigned to his grim fate. Beside him sat David Ross, playing the role of the overwhelmed, outmatched public defender to utter perfection, repeatedly dropping his pens and shuffling messy stacks of useless paper. Is the prosecution ready to proceed with this monumental waste of the taxpayers' time? Langford boomed, his voice immediately silencing the murmuring crowd. We are, Your Honor, the ADA replied confidently, strutting to the center of the room. Over the next 4 hours, the prosecution laid out a masterful, completely fabricated, yet incredibly convincing case. They presented the doctored bank statements projected on a large screen. They played carefully spliced out of context audio recordings from a municipal meeting that sounded damning. Finally, for the finishing blow, they called Officer Miller to the stand. Miller, sweating slightly under the harsh courtroom lighting, smoothly recited his heavily rehearsed lies. He testified about the routine traffic stop, the highly suspicious and nervous behavior of the defendant, and the shocking discovery of the cash hidden under a spare tire. And did the defendant attempt to explain the $300,000 of stolen city funds in his trunk? The ADA asked, pacing slowly before the captivated jury box. He claimed he had never seen it before, sir. The classic desperate excuse of a guilty man, Miller smirked, casting a quick seeking glance up at Langford, who offered a microscopic approving nod. David Ross stood up for cross-examination, intentionally fumbling with his legal pad. Officer Miller, isn't it true that, well, that the area under Wacker Drive was quite dark? Is it at all possible, in your professional opinion, that someone could have placed the bag there without your immediate knowledge? Objection, the ADA shouted, slamming a hand on his table. Calls for pure speculation and borders on the absurd. Sustained, Langford snapped immediately, slamming his gavel with a violent crack. Counselor, if you don't have substantive, factual questions for this decorated witness, please sit down. I will not have my courtroom's valuable time wasted on your fairy tales. No further questions, Your Honor, Ross mumbled, hanging his head and taking his seat. The jury looked at Leonard with undisguised, open disgust. The reporters scribbled furiously in their notepads, drafting headlines condemning Hayes. Langford leaned back in his plush leather chair, a feeling of immense euphoric triumph washing over his entire body. It was a total slaughter. He had successfully legally buried his own heinous crimes underneath the ruined life of this insignificant contractor. The trial was playing out exactly according to his script. Does the prosecution rest its case? Langford asked, practically tasting the expensive celebratory scotch he would drink later. The prosecution rests, Your Honor. Langford turned his gaze down to the defense table, his eyes locking onto Leonard like a hawk regarding a dead mouse. He allowed a cruel, openly patronizing smile to touch his lips. Mr. Ross, does the defense have any witnesses to call before we move to closing arguments, or are we finally ready to conclude this unfortunate matter? The courtroom was dead silent. Everyone expected the defense to fold immediately. But then the script permanently changed. Leonard Hayes slowly placed his large hands flat on the polished wooden table. The stooped, defeated posture vanished in a microsecond. His shoulders broadened. He stood up to his full 6 feet 2 inches height, towering over his attorney. His face completely devoid of the fear and resignation he had masterfully projected for weeks. He looked straight up at the bench, his eyes burning with an intense, terrifying, undiluted clarity. "Yes, Your Honor," Leonard said, his voice no longer shaking. It was deep, resonant, and carried a sudden, undeniable air of absolute authority that made the entire courtroom collectively hold its breath. The defense calls one witness. I am taking the stand. A low, shocked murmur rippled through the packed gallery like a wave. Defendants in high-stakes corruption and grand larceny cases rarely, if ever, took the stand. It was universally considered legal suicide. Judge Langford's patronizing smile faltered for a fraction of a second, quickly replaced by a flicker of genuine irritation. He hated deviations from his plans. "Very well, Mr. Hayes," Langford sneered, his voice dripping with venomous condescension. "If you wish to hang yourself on the public record, the court will graciously allow it. Bailiff, swear the defendant in." Leonard walked to the witness stand with purposeful, measured, heavy steps. The orange jumpsuit was gone, but even in the cheap gray suit, he suddenly carried himself like a man who owned the entire building. He placed his right hand firmly on the Bible, swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, and sat down. He didn't look at his lawyer. He looked dead center at Judge Victor Langford, locking eyes with the corrupt man. David Ross approached the central podium. The bumbling, nervous, incompetent demeanor had completely evaporated. He stood tall, adjusting his glasses, looking every bit the ruthless elite federal prosecutor he truly was. "Please state your full legal name for the record," Ross commanded, his voice sharp, clear, and commanding. "My name is Leonard Vance Hayes," Leonard replied, his voice steady as bedrock. "Mr. Hayes, the prosecution has spent the last 4 hours painting you as a mid-level construction contractor who orchestrated a massive municipal bribe. Is that your true occupation?" "No, sir, it is not," Leonard said calmly, his gaze never leaving the judge. The ADA jumped up, his chair scraping loudly. "Objection, Your Honor. This is ridiculous. The defendant's employment records, W-2s, and union cards were all entered into evidence without contest." "Overruled," for the moment, Langford interrupted, leaning dangerously forward over his bench, his eyes narrowing as a cold dread began to pull in his stomach. "Let the man speak his piece. What exactly do you claim to do for a living, Mr. Hayes?" Leonard held Langford's gaze. The air in the courtroom grew incredibly heavy, as if the atmospheric pressure had suddenly dropped. "I am a sworn federal law enforcement officer. Specifically, I am the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Public Corruption Task Force, operating out of Washington, D.C. My official badge number is 884 Delta 7, and I have full jurisdictional authority in this room." Total, absolute, deafening silence fell over the courtroom. A reporter in the second row literally dropped her pen. The clatter echoed like a gunshot. The jury stared with their mouths agape in stunned disbelief. Langford's face instantly lost all its color, turning an ashen, sickly shade of gray. The heavy wooden gavel slipped slightly in his suddenly sweaty grip. "Excuse me. What kind of absurd theatrical perjury is this? You are a criminal. I will hold you in contempt of court." "I have been operating deep undercover in Chicago for the past 6 months, Leonard continued, his voice amplifying, echoing powerfully off the walls, cutting right through the judge's panicked bluster. "My sole assignment was to investigate, document, and dismantle a massive, deeply entrenched money laundering, extortion, and judicial fixing syndicate. A highly illegal syndicate operating directly out of this very building and managed from your private chambers. Bailiff, arrest him. Remove this insane man from the stand immediately," Langford screamed, raw panic finally shattering his composed, regal facade. He was standing now, pointing a trembling finger. "This trial is indefinitely suspended. I declare a mistrial." You don't have the authority to declare anything anymore, Victor, Leonard said, his voice dropping an octave, completely dropping the Your Honor. At that exact calculated moment, the heavy double oak doors at the back of the courtroom violently burst open. A dozen heavily armed federal agents wearing dark tactical vests emblazoned with FBI in bright yellow letters swarmed into the room, their weapons drawn but lowered. The crowd erupted into terrified screams and gasps. Reporters scrambled frantically over the wooden benches, desperate to get out of the line of fire. Special Agent Sarah Jenkins strode down the center aisle, holding a thick, bound stack of federal warrants sealed by the United States Attorney General. Nobody move. Federal agents. Secure all exits. Nobody leaves this room, she shouted, her voice booming with unquestionable authority. Langford stumbled backward, knocking over his expensive leather chair. He looked desperately toward the private side exit leading to his safe haven, his chambers. But two heavily armed tactical agents had already breached the back halls and were blocking the door. The invincible king of the courtroom was suddenly trapped inside a cage of his own making. Leonard stepped down from the witness box, ignoring the chaos erupting around him. He walked slowly, purposefully, toward the bench, looking up at the terrified, hyperventilating, trembling men who had casually tried to throw his entire life away. Judge Victor Langford, Leonard said, his voice devoid of any sympathy, cold as ice. We have the Title III wiretaps from your celebratory dinner with Marcus Thorne. We have the decrypted offshore routing numbers from your illicit accounts at Credit Suisse. We have Officer Miller, who gave us a full signed confession 20 minutes ago in an interrogation room downstairs in exchange for federal protection. We have absolutely everything. It's over. Langford's mouth opened and closed silently like a dying fish pulled onto a dock. He gripped the edge of his bench to keep from collapsing. You set me up. This is illegal. You entrapped me. No, Victor, Leonard replied coldly, turning his back on the broken man. I just stood quietly in your way. You actively chose to run me over. You chose to frame an innocent man because you arrogantly thought he was powerless. But you picked the wrong man. The aftermath in the courtroom was swift, chaotic, and utterly merciless. Right there in front of the horrified, breathless jury, the furiously flashing cameras of the local press, and the very legal community he had terrorized, blackmailed, and manipulated for a decade, Judge Victor Langford was publicly read his Miranda rights. Agent Jenkins forcefully yanked Langford's arms behind his back, uncaring of his status. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed through the cavernous courtroom, a sound that sounded exactly like the gavel strikes Langford had used to destroy so many innocent lives for profit. Victor Langford, you are under federal arrest for egregious violation of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, conspiracy to commit massive wire fraud, extortion under the color of official right, and obstruction of justice, Jenkins recited flawlessly, her grip unyielding as Langford tried to squirm. Langford was physically shaking, his prestigious black robes tangling awkwardly around his legs as he was marched down from his elevated bench in disgrace. He looked completely diminished, a small, pathetic, terrified man finally stripped of his unearned power and false nobility. The reporters were screaming overlapping questions, camera flashes illuminating his terrified, tear-streaked face like strobe lights. This is a massive mistake. You can't do this to me. I know United States senators. I know the governor, Langford babbled hysterically, spittle flying from his lips as the agents dragged him mercilessly down the center aisle toward the waiting transport vans. Leonard stood near the defense table, watching the pathetic spectacle with a quiet, solemn intensity. David Ross walked up beside him, smiling broadly. Ross handed Leonard his gold FBI badge and a sharply tailored suit jacket they had smuggled into the building during the chaos. Flawless execution, Director. Truly a masterclass, Ross said quietly over the din of the reporters. The secondary warrants for his offshore accounts just executed 3 minutes ago. We successfully froze $80 million. The rest of his police network is being rounded up across the city as we speak. Marcus Thorne just surrendered himself at the field office, crying like a baby. Good, Leonard said, slipping on his tailored jacket and proudly pinning his gold FBI shield to his left lapel. The weight of the badge felt incredibly satisfying after weeks of playing a helpless victim in a cold cell. Make sure Langford bypasses the local lockup entirely. He goes straight to the federal holding facility in Marion. I don't want him anywhere near the county system he used to control and manipulate. I want him in solitary. I want him to realize exactly how powerless he truly is. As Langford was roughly shoved through the heavy wooden double doors at the back of the courtroom, he managed to twist his head back, locking eyes with Leonard across the room one last time. The look of pure, unadulterated hatred mixed with profound, soul-crushing defeat was etched permanently onto the corrupt judge's face. He had thought he was a literal god in his courtroom, immune to the laws he preached. But karma had finally come to collect its heavy toll, and it was wearing a federal badge. Leonard turned away from the door, ignoring the chaos of the press frantically calling their editors on their cell phones to report the story of the decade. He took a deep, cleansing breath, the stale, tense air of the courtroom suddenly feeling a little cleaner, a little lighter. The justice system was flawed, deeply broken in places, and opportunistic men like Langford existed like parasites feeding within it. But as long as Leonard Hayes was breathing, and men and women like him stood the line, he would be the cure. He walked out the side doors, striding past the empty, permanently disgraced bench, and headed out onto the steps of the courthouse. The bright freezing winds of Chicago whipped across his face, but it felt like a victory lap. The job wasn't over. Corruption never truly slept. It never was over. But today, against impossible odds, the scales of justice had been forcefully, permanently rebalanced.